Well, hello. Let me first of all greet all of you. And it is really a big joy to talk to young people from over 20 countries, because right now we are in the most incredible moment in history ever. I know you can say that for many moments of history, but I think we have never been at a time where, on the one side, the dangers to the very existence of mankind have never been so great. But at the same time, it is also a very joyful and hopeful moment, because we are in a transformation where one system, the old neoliberal order, the so-called rules-based order, is clearly failing. And we are seeing the emergence of a completely new paradigm, which promises to become a much, much better basis for the relations among countries internationally, among each other. Now, let me first speak a little bit about what to do about this war danger. The fact is that because you have the collapse of the neoliberal order, those forces who want to keep an unipolar world, or at least a world in which the old system of the rules-based order keep the dominance over the rest of the world, and that clearly is not working, we indeed have the danger that the present crises, which we see in Ukraine and very emphatically in Southwest Asia, both unfortunately have the potential of getting out of control and, in the worst case, become a global nuclear war, which, if it would come to that, which we must do everything possible to prevent, it would mean the annihilation of the civilization. Because once you have the exchange of nuclear weapons, and I completely refute the idea that something like a tactical regional nuclear war is possible, because it is the logic of nuclear war that once one nuclear weapon is used, the likelihood that the entire arsenal of all nuclear forces will be unloaded is extremely high. And that would mean that following such a nuclear exchange, there would be a nuclear winter of about minimum 10 years, in which all life on Earth would die because of a lack of sun, a lack of food. So this is why I think the young people, who have your entire life, hopefully ahead of you, have to have a stronger voice in, making clear that the powers to be stop a course which, is so threatening to the very existence of humanity. And therefore, what the Schiller Institute is trying to do, since the war danger has become so absolutely acute, essentially since the war in Ukraine started, we have emphasized very much that we have to teach people in every country of the planet to think about the one mankind first, before you think about any particular national interest. To think about the one humanity. And, that is not a contradiction to being a good patriot, because, as Friedrich Schiller, according to whom the Schiller Institute is called, the great German poet of freedom, there is no contradiction between being a patriot of your own country and thinking and acting as a world citizen. Now, I have coined a slogan which is called "World Citizens of All Countries Unite." Now, some of you who are familiar with Karl Marx may remember that he coined the notion proletarians of all countries unite. Now, since I have the privilege to be born in the same city like Karl Marx, the oldest city in Germany, Trier, I have just changed that into "World Citizens of All Countries Unite." And that is not just a slogan, because I believe that, as we see the tendency of the global majority becoming more and more prominent, that we are also, in an era where white sovereignty is extremely important and will be important for quite some time to come. Nevertheless, we are already in a period where you can see that there will come a time in history where nations will be less important. They will not disappear because culture, language, tradition, art will always play a very important role. But we, for sure, as a human species, will eventually reach an identity where we are much more conscious to be the one humanity. And I'll return to that later on. Now, there is also one philosophical foundation why one can think the one humanity. It's a philosophical method which has been developed by one of my favorite philosophers, Nicolaus of Cues, who was the founder of modern science in Europe, the founder of the sovereign nation state, and he lived in the 15th century. And he developed a method of thinking which he called the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. Now, the main idea behind that is that the human mind, empowered with creative reason, can always think of a higher one than the many. Now, obviously, Nicolaus of Cues, who was the cardinal of the Catholic Church and the foreign minister of the Vatican of his time, arrived at this idea because of theological, considerations that the one God has more power than all the many he created. But it's also something you can access if you're not religious, because in mathematics, you have also the idea that there can be always a mathematical power which has more power than the many. And I think that is a very helpful, and we should discuss this maybe in the discussion period. It's a very helpful device because, people, especially in a world where you have some people saying America first, other people say my country is the chosen country. And I, coming from Germany, I'm in the meantime extremely reluctant whenever somebody says my country is the best, because we in Germany did not have so great experiences with that. So, but to come at this thinking about the interest of the one humanity first, I think is of existential importance when it comes to the danger of nuclear war. Now, right now, we are in a situation where many people in the West are talking about the coming inevitable war with Russia, with China. You have people in Sweden, in Finland, in Germany who are saying that the war with Russia comes in 2 years, in 3 years, on Swedish territory. Just yesterday, the head of the military committee of NATO, Admiral Rob Bauer, said that in NATO we must have a red alert because of the inevitable war with Russia coming. And, I think this is obviously propaganda. It's a narrative because, there is no inevitable danger of a war with Russia. Now, if you look at the reason why people are saying this, it has nothing to do with the actual behavior of Russia or China. It has a lot to do with geopolitics. Now, if you ask yourself, how did we come to a situation where, the danger of nuclear war is being earnestly discussed, like the head of NATO saying that, or one of the heads of NATO? You have to take it back, and I could take it back a lot longer, but I want to take it back to the end of the so-called Cold War. This was 1989, 90, 91, this period of the German unification when the Soviet Union disintegrated. Now, at that time, we already were extremely active as the LaRouche movement, as Schiller Institute, because we had a clear conception when the Soviet Union disintegrated. We proposed the Eurasian land bridge as the basis for a peace order uniting Europe and Asia through development corridors. And we already called it at that time the New Silk Road. Now, that would have been an absolute realizable conception because, there was no more enemy, in quote. Communism of the Soviet Union had just disappeared. And it would have been possible to at least, design a European common house, as Gorbachev at the time talked about. But, I spare you the many aspects of it. The reality was that our proposal was rejected because in the United States and Great Britain, you had the neocons who said, oh, wonderful, the Soviet Union is no longer there. Now we have won the Cold War and we can establish an unipolar world where only we are the dominant power. And there was one fellow in particular who designed this. This was Wolfowitz, one of the defense experts of the United States, he coined the Wolfowitz doctrine, which was the idea that now that the West supposedly had won the Cold War, that the United States would not allow any other country or group of countries to ever bypass the United States economically, socially, militarily, or otherwise. And unfortunately, that policy went into effect. At that time, you had an American historian called Fukuyama who said, that this was the end of history. What they meant by that was that, given the fact that communism supposedly had failed, that the whole world would adopt the neoliberal economic model and the liberal model of social policy. And they basically, said that will mean there will be no more war, there will be the end of history. Now, the Pope of that time, the Catholic Pope, John Paul II, warned and said, no, this is not that the West has won, because the whole world is still under the rule of the structures of sin. That the structures of sin did not only exist in the Soviet Union, but they also exist in the West. And the Pope said, if you don't believe it, look at the condition of the third world to see the underdevelopment, the poverty, that these structures of sin still rule. Now, in the beginning of the 90s, there was no Russia being an enemy because President Yeltsin, who completely implemented the neoliberal policies, the liberal economic reforms, he did exactly what the Western oligarchy wanted from him. So there was no problem from their standpoint with Russia, except that the demographic curve of Russia collapsed by 1 million per year. And the Russian economist Sergei Glaziev called that genocide because, the intention was to reduce the Russian population, ruin Russia already then, under the guise of liberal policies. And China was not an enemy either, because China was still developing, having made already incredible progress, but it was not yet anywhere near challenging the United States. But then, basically, after China became a member of the WTO, which the Western forces had invited China to be part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is because they thought once China is part of our World Trade Organization, they will also adopt the liberal model and become part of us. Now, that all started to change when Putin came to replace Yeltsin, because Putin was determined to undo the liberal reforms, re-establish Russia as a global power, which, under Yeltsin, it had basically collapsed. And then they started to say, Putin is really an enemy. And naturally, when China became part of the WTO, it really meant that China all of a sudden had access to all the advanced technologies. And, it started a big jump in productivity, in, lifting altogether 850 million people out of poverty in China, which was an incredible civilizational contribution. But, eventually China did not adopt the liberal model of the West, but to the contrary, China turned back to its 5,000-year cultural tradition. And they called this the Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics. And naturally, then, China was making an incredible motion forward. So that finally, in 2013, China felt strong enough, which it had tried earlier but not succeeded, economically strong enough to offer the rest of the world to participate in the Chinese model. This was when President Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan announced the Belt and Road Initiative. And, then the economic development started to spread from China. They offered many economic cooperation agreements with the countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia. And, by about 2017, the West really started to treat China as an adversary. We observed this very closely because, we had our own plan for a world land bridge, for a Eurasian land bridge extending into all continents, which we published in 2014 already as a book called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. So we were quite surprised that for the first 4 years, there was almost no coverage about the New Silk Road in the Western media. But then, end of 2017, all the security papers of the US first, and then all the European allies started to treat China as an adversary, as a competitor, but also more and more as a threat. Now, the effort to maintain the unipolar world was expressed, among other things, by altogether first 5 eastward extensions of NATO, bringing, while they had promised that NATO would not move 1 inch to the west after the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO moved 1,000 kilometers to the east, closer and closer to the borders of Russia. And in 2014, the Western powers made the Maidan coup, which was a fascist coup, financed, among others, by the State Department for $5 billion. This was admitted by Victoria Nuland. And the idea was that NATO would basically extend into Ukraine. Now, from the standpoint of the security interest, this was unacceptable because, it's like if you bring, during the Cuba crisis, when the Soviet Union brought their missiles, which were nuclear armed, to Cuba, it came to a Cuba crisis. Now, it should be obvious to anybody, if NATO is trying to do the same thing the other way around by bringing offensive weapon systems to the border of Russia, that this would be a reversed Cuban crisis. So this is when the war in Ukraine really started. It started actually in 2014. Now, after that, the sanctions regime against Russia became more brutal all the time. And eventually, this even led to the weaponization of the dollar after the special military operation had started on the 24th of February 22. So at that point, we entered the present showdown phase of the situation. because, the Western democracies, and I almost have to put this democracies in quotation, they tried all the time to pull the majority of the global South country, of Africa, of Latin America, of Asia, into the camp of the so-called democracies. But the countries of the global South, they looked at this whole situation, and, since they had been the victim of colonialism for almost 600 years, they did not buy the narrative which was put out by the US and the European media, and they refused to take the side of the West, basically insisting that they would remain neutral. And from that time, there was an absolute explosion in the tradition and memory of the non-aligned movement. The spirit of Bandung, the first Afro-Asian conference of 1955, that came back with a vengeance, one can say. And the countries of the global South, more and more, being encouraged by China, because they had for the first time an alternative for development, while, in all these years before, the West had not given them credit for infrastructure. Why did the Europeans not, in the years after the Second World War, give them long-term interest, credit with low interest to build infrastructure, ports, railway, industrial parks? They did not. Instead, they had the IMF conditionalities, which, meant that the third world country, or so-called third world country, would have to spend the money they would make from exporting raw materials, not to invest in health system, not to invest in infrastructure, but to pay their debt to the banks of the Paris Club first. So therefore, basically what then happened is that the global South became stronger and stronger. The BRICS, the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, they became more active, and eventually, at the end of last year, in the summit in Johannesburg, they decided to become the BRICS Plus. From the January 1st of this year, it's the BRICS 10, Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, which is in the process of becoming the Emirates, and Iran are all members of the BRICS, and about 30 or 40 countries have already applied to become part of the new economic system, which is also intending to create a new reserve currency, to have an own economic system. And after the weaponization of the dollar, when the US and European banks confiscated about 300 billion of Russian assets and 9.5 billion of the Afghanistan assets, basically these countries started to say, well, maybe it's not such a safe thing to have your assets in dollar. Maybe we should have trade in our own currencies, rupees, real, rubles, and others. So basically, this is where we are at right now, because this year, Russia has the chairmanship of the BRICS Plus, and I absolutely expect that in the present situation, the BRICS will make a gigantic step forward to become a new economic system. Now, this is a system which is very much different than the so-called rules-based order, because they do not have a secretariat, they do not have a common policy they want to impose on the rest of the world, but among them, they respect each other's sovereignty, the different social system, that every country can choose their own path for development. So I think there has to be another point in the picture. With the recent suit by South Africa against Israel for committing genocide in Gaza, This is a world historical event because, as it has been stated by many people, how can you deny that there is genocide going on in Gaza when the TV stations of the whole world are streaming live what is going on in Gaza every day, where you can see when you seal off a tiny strip of land and you make sure that for 3 and more months, no food, no electricity, no medicine, no water is coming in. And even the United Nations is saying that, it is expected that the number of people dying of disease as a result of this will be much higher than those who will have died because of the bombing. The intent is very, very clear. So at the World Court of Justice in Den Haag, the South African government presented this case with 84 pages documenting what is going on in Gaza. And I watched the first 3 hours of the presentation and some of the second part of the 3 hours. And I have never seen such an airtight legal argument, not only showing the dimension of the humanitarian crisis, but also, the clear intent which, when you have all the top officials of Israel saying, that talking about the Amalek, talking about animals, that nobody should survive, and then seeing the soldiers dancing, being in a frenzy, Anyway, so I think the significance of this is historic because it proves that the country of South Africa, which went through apartheid and overcame a system of racism of the worst kind, they have taken the leadership for the whole world. When the West, those countries with the so-called, high moral standard, talking about democracy and human rights, when confronted with this incredible situation in Gaza, are covering up and are not bringing it to the Court of Justice. It was South Africa which saved the honor of humanity. And that is symptomatic for the kind of change we are seeing in the world right now. And I think this will have reverberations, because the whole world, the whole global majority is siding with South Africa. And, I'm very sad to say that, but Germany took the wrong side in this battle by siding with the United States and Israel, with the mistaken argument that because Germany committed a genocide more than 80 years ago, that, we have to stand by the side of Israel no matter what they do. This is a wrong idea, and, I'm very saddened by it. And hopefully, we can remedy it. Now, I hope that we can remedy it because there is something positive to be reported from Germany, and that is that actually almost unexpectedly, a couple of weeks, the German farmers started to take to the streets to protest against cuts in their, various budgets and programs, subsidies for fuel, which threatens to bankrupt them. And so they're now on the streets. They had on one day more than 100,000 tractors. They basically blocked all the main highways. They had one full week of demonstrations, and it is not stopping. They are now uniting with the truckers. The truckers are also protesting, and many other segments of the population are also supporting them because their own existence is at stake as well. The bakers, the restaurant owners, other categories. And hopefully, the industrialists will realize that they are in a similar position because this present neoliberal system is threatening Germany to crash completely against the wall. Now, let me make another point, and that is, I think what we see right now with the fight of the German farmers and the fight of the global South, it is actually the same fight. Now, that may not be apparent to people in, Bavaria or people in Somalia, or, they may not look at it this way. But actually, if you really understand what is going on, it is the same fight. Because what are the countries of the global South fighting against? They are fighting against a system of control of the terms of trade. They are now demanding that every country of the developing sector has the right not only to develop your own resources, to increase the chain of the production chain, the value chain in your own country by developing industries, agriculture, infrastructure, building new cities, going into new areas of science and technology. In other words, becoming a middle income country in the near future. Well, who is trying to block that? Well, it's the institutions of the finance of Wall Street, the City of London. It's the military-industrial complex of the North, of NATO, and the food cartels. Because if you look at the charts of who are the powers to be in the Wall Street, in the City of London, and other financial centers, these complexes, finance, military-industrial, and food cartels and reinsurance companies, they are so interwoven that you cannot separate them one iota. Now, therefore, the farmers who are fighting against the same cartels and the developing countries who are fighting against that same thing, they have much more in common than meets the eye. And one of the purposes, what we want to accomplish is, to match these two powerful motions to become one, because the only way, in my view, how we will get out of this crisis is by uniting the people of Europe and the United States with the people of the global South. I cannot see any other solution, because that is the one new paradigm we have to accomplish. Now, when I say that we have to come to this new paradigm, ending the 600-year of colonial era for the global South. Now, let me quickly introduce my 10 principles, because about 2 years ago, I started to suggest a new security and development architecture, which has to replace the present geopolitical order. And I would like, maybe if some of you have thought about it already, that we discuss how to actually put such a new security order on the table. And the 10 principles which I proposed, first of all, the absolute sovereignty of every country needs to be respected. There must be the absolute eradication of poverty on the whole world, a universal health system in every country, universal education for every newborn child and adult person, a credit system which can finance that, a world land bridge to bring infrastructure into all corners of the planet, and then 3 philosophical ideas, namely this method of the coincidence of opposite as a method of solving problems, and the discussion of how to find out the truth, how do you differentiate between opinion and narrative and the actual truth. And there is a method which is that, natural science gives us right now a way of indeed finding the truth and the effect of ideas in the physical universe. And finally, the discussion about the image of man, that man is good by nature. Now, that is not too long a discussion, but we can come back to it in the Q&A. But let me introduce one other train of thought. And that is that I want to encourage all of you and actually excite you and interest you to study the ideas of my late husband, LaRouche. Because, the fact that our movement at all exists is a miracle. Because we were supposed to be smashed, don't exist, eradicated from the face of the earth. Why? Because LaRouche has developed a method of thinking which, is the way to set people free, how to unleash your own creativity, and to give you the key that, actually almost everybody can become a genius. However, it requires a certain amount of industrioususness. It's not falling from the heaven as manna, but it does require work. But let me give you a couple of ideas why I'm saying that. Our movement is based on the ideas of LaRouche, who developed a method of thinking which is based on physical economy. It's based on a method of, identifying the axioms of thinking, not just go by whatever people say, but immediately look at it analytically, identify the axioms and, assumptions on which certain statements are made. And that way you find an unmistaken key to, every area of knowledge. Now, that method of thinking enabled him to already make a prognosis about the present situation today, where we have a systemic collapse of the, neoliberal order. He already identified that in 1971, when President Nixon at that time decoupled the dollar from the gold standard and introduced floating exchange rates, because he recognized that the taking down of the old Bretton Woods system, the credit system which was established in the post-war period, and replacing it with a system which was entirely oriented towards the profit maximization, and therefore naturally, the disrespect for the common interest of the general population, that would lead inevitably to a new depression, a new fascism, and the danger of a new nuclear war, unless you would replace this system with a completely different economic order. Now, I can only encourage you to look into the writings of what we have published in the last, actually 50 years, to see how absolutely accurate he was in predicting every turn of the present financial system to the worse. Many newspapers and liberal economists, they had insisted that no economist could ever know that, the world financial system would enter the present crisis. Now, we can prove that that is not true, because all the steps which occurred, he identified with absolute precision. The fact that the reason why the United States economy is in such a poor condition, except for its military-industrial complex, well, they did the outsourcing of a lot of their production into so-called cheap labor markets. They shifted from an orientation of the common good to a shareholder value society. They changed reasonable having a full chain production in your own country. They changed to the just-in-time mode. They basically went more and more to the idea money makes money, which ended up in the derivative trade, which now has amounted to 2 quadrillion derivatives in outstanding derivative contracts right now, which are unpayable. And that is why we are right now in danger of a total collapse of the financial system. Now, that method of thinking is very much associated with understanding, what is it what makes society move forward? What is the source of wealth? Namely, that it is entirely the creative powers of the individual, which is able again and again to come up with new ideas, identifying qualitative breakthroughs in science, in great art, identifying principles which give us a new insight in how the physical universe works. And when we apply these principles in the production process, it leads to an increase in the productivity of the people, of the industrial capacity, and the productivity in general, leading to an increase of the physical wealth again and again and again. So it is not the possession of raw materials. It is not the control of the terms of trade, what the free market economists are saying. It is entirely the ability of the human mind to use the creative powers to make discoveries of physical principles, qualitatively new principles, apply them in the production process, and in this way increase the power of man over nature and over the universe. And that is the right which has been denied to the developing countries until the recent struggle where the global south is insisting that you have to apply your innate right to apply this principle to your own economies. Now, this is basically associated with the image of man. The ecologists are trying to convince people that man is a parasite, that man is a burden to nature, that some even go so far to say that women should not have children anymore because every newborn child is a burden to nature. There are books like that in Germany and in the US. And, some other people are saying, that man is only the steward of nature, but should sort of face in not being different than the other species. Other living, even plants have an equal right to human beings. Well, I think this is a fundamentally wrong conception. And LaRouche, already in, very early of his creative work, which lasted actually, I would say, probably 8 decades. That's about right. Very early on, he recognized the importance of space travel. And this is very, very important because this is important for the young people today because, we are having a huge cultural crisis. There are studies everywhere that young people have a concentration span like a grasshopper. They are married to their iPad or other electronic devices and, are increasingly incapable of interacting socially and thinking about a world and their own life, which is not located in the here and now. Now, LaRouche made many speeches about why it is so important to lift the eyes and the mind to the stars and start to think about space science, space travel. And, the obvious fact, which, everybody who starts to look into it is aware of, that our planet Earth will not be livable forever, but that because of certain processes in the galaxy and in the cycle of the Milky Road, sometimes about a billion or 2 billion, not exactly clear, time from now, our planet will not be so livable anymore. And, we have to think about expanding in the universe at large. Now, this poses all the right challenges, because the moment you start to think, and just yesterday the Japanese landed an object on the moon, may not function perfectly, but they are now the fifth nation being able to do so. And it is very clear that, our present phase of space exploration is just in the baby shoes, and that, think about 2, 3, 4 generations ahead of time, that the idea, once we conquer different fuels for space travel, like fusion, for example, that the travel time to the Mars and other planets will become much less, and therefore much more realistic that we explore nearby space. That the moment we leave Earth, we are leaving the gravity zone of Earth, and therefore we are entering a relativistic space and time. And that completely changes the kinds of laws we have to deal with, which Einstein enabled us to even think about. And even before, even Sina had similar ideas, but that's a different matter. So that basically, if you think about that, we with our life, not only have to solve the problems of the present, transformation of an old order, which is still colonial, into a new paradigm where the one humanity will be the first one, the first consideration. Latest, when we think about space travel, the concept of one humanity will become much more obvious, because we should not think about, who controls the moon or other such silly headlines you can read these days, or who will weaponize space to better conduct war on Earth from space. No, this comes to the very question of the identity. Who are we in the universe? And, when you look at, for example, what the Hubble telescope found, or now the James Webb telescope, there are at least 2 trillion galaxies. Now, this for me is one of the most mind-boggling ideas. When you look up to the stars and you think there's so many stars, and but this is just the tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. 2 trillion galaxies. I mean, we are just at the very beginning of exploring, what the universe is all about, how it functions, and how can we maintain the existence of the human species in a more immortal way. Now, obviously, each of us are mortal. We are born and we die, and the short span between these two poles, most people are wasting it, because, before they even get to the idea that they could contribute something lasting with their life, they become old and senile, and they have missed the opportunity to do so. But the reality is that once you understand that our identity as human beings is not limited to our biological existence, but that when we truly develop our creative potential and contribute some knowledge to the existing body of knowledge of mankind as a whole, and in this way increasing the ability of mankind for a durable existence, this exists even after we are dead. And in this way, like that, we are creating immortal ideas in science, in art, that we contribute to the immortality of the human species at large, but also participate in that immortality if we produce such valid ideas. Now, I have an absolute optimistic view about the future of mankind, because I think that once we create a world where geopolitical confrontation is overcome by the idea that we have a new relations among nations, respecting the other, bring forward the best tradition, that we have a dialogue of civilizations and cultures where each nation and each civilization actualizes the best they have ever produced in terms of culture, poetry, science, all the beautiful things people in past generations have produced, and we enter a dialogue with the other nation, bringing forward the best they ever have produced, that we will really grow up. Because I think that the present situation on the world, I always compare with, 4-year-old boys. I have a horror of those 4-year-old boys because they tend to kick each other. And, we as nations should not behave like 4-year-old boys. But that when we develop our creativity in the way I was trying to mention before, relating to the creative potential of the other person, the other nation, and vice versa, that we will enter the age of adulthood of mankind, and that there is absolutely no limit to what we can accomplish as the only creative species known in the universe so far. And I think that is where we are on the verge to reach. This is why I'm saying this is the most exciting moment in history, because, while the danger of complete extinction in a nuclear war has never existed like now, at the same time, if we overcome this present difficulty, because in the long arc of history, it's not more than a difficulty, and actually truly realize what we are as a creative species, I think that, we enter a period, a new renaissance, which will be much more human and much more beautiful than anything we have experienced so far. And I want to invite you to be part of it and think about yourself, of shaping it, of not just sitting there watching how it develops, but to become an active part in making our world more human, more livable, and more beautiful. Thank you.